He mocked the crippled janitor without mercy. But years later, that same janitor faced a life-or-death choice: save him or let him fall. What happened next shattered everything he thought he knew. Welcome back, my amazing family and friends. If you're ready to dive into this unforgettable story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll bring you another incredible tale you absolutely can't miss. Let's get started. And don't forget to like and share to help our community grow. The fluorescent lights of Harrington Towers hummed their lonely midnight song as Jerome Wallace guided his cleaning cart down the empty hallway of the 42nd floor. His right leg, twisted from a childhood accident that had never been properly treated, scraped against the marble with each labored step, a sound he'd long ago stopped apologizing for. At 53, he'd cleaned these halls for 15 years, and his limp had worn a faint groove into the route he took every night. The building was different after dark. During the day, it buzzed with the energy of Seattle's most prestigious corporate offices, young executives in $1,000 suits, their voices sharp with ambition, their eyes sliding past Jerome as if he were part of the furniture. But now, in the hollow hours between midnight and dawn, the tower belonged to people like him, the invisible ones who scrubbed away the evidence of other people's success. Jerome's hands, strong despite the arthritis beginning to settle in his knuckles, wrung out the mop with practiced efficiency. The motion was meditative, almost peaceful. He'd learned long ago to find dignity in this work, even when the world insisted there was none to be found. His late mother, God rest her soul, had cleaned houses in Alabama before the family moved west. Honest work isn't nothing to be ashamed of, she told him countless times, her own hands raw from bleach and determination. The executive suite at the end of the hall was always last on his route. Corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, leather furniture that cost more than Jerome made in a year. It belonged to one of the company's rising stars, some hotshot VP who'd climbed the ranks with a kind of ruthless efficiency that made people whisper. Jerome had seen dozens like him come and go over the years, each one convinced they were different, special, destined for something greater than the people who cleaned up after them. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, and that's when he saw it. The silver-framed photograph on the desk, illuminated by the city lights filtering through the windows. Jerome's heart stuttered, then began to pound. He stepped closer, his limp more pronounced as his leg trembled beneath him. The face in the photo was older, sharper, hardened by time and ambition. But Jerome would have recognized those cold blue eyes anywhere. They were the same eyes that had watched him, 15 years ago, with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "No," Jerome whispered, his voice hoarse in the empty office. "It can't be." But it was. Ethan Crawford. The name was engraved on a crystal award on the shelf. Vice President of Strategic Development. 38 years old. Fast-tracked for executive leadership. 15 years ago, he'd been Ethan Crawford, 23-year-old intern, fresh out of Stanford with his father's connections and his own unshakable confidence. And Jerome had been the same man he was now, just a janitor with a twisted leg and a mop bucket. The memory crashed over Jerome like a wave, pulling him back to that day he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. 15 years earlier. It had been a Tuesday afternoon, unseasonably warm for Seattle in October. Jerome had been working the day shift back then, covering for another janitor who'd called in sick. The building had been full of life, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, the coffee machine in the break room grinding out cup after cup of dark roast. He'd been mopping the hallway outside the conference rooms when he heard the voices. Young, cocky, drunk on their own potential. A group of interns, their summer program nearly complete, celebrating their upcoming offers with an extended lunch that had involved more than a few glasses of wine from the Italian place downstairs. Jerome had tried to make himself smaller, the way he always did. Head down, mop moving in steady circles, invisible. Jesus Christ, did you see that? The voice had cut through the ambient noise like a knife. Jerome's hands had tightened on the mop handle, but he'd kept moving, kept his eyes on the floor. See what? Another voice, female, curious. The way that janitor walks. Dude looks like he's doing some kind of twisted tango with that leg. Laughter. Multiple voices joining in. Jerome had felt his face burn, his chest tightens. Keep moving, he'd told himself. Just keep moving. Maybe he's practicing for Dancing with the Stars, Disability Edition. The voice was closer now, right behind him. Hey, buddy, you should really get that looked at. Oh wait, I forgot, you probably can't afford a real doctor on a janitor's salary. Jerome had stopped then, his pride finally overriding his instinct to disappear. He'd turned slowly, his twisted leg dragging across the wet floor, to face his tormentor. Ethan Crawford had been grinning, his perfect teeth white against his summer tan, his designer suit jacket slung over one shoulder. He was tall, athletic, radiating the kind of careless confidence that came from never having to worry about anything. Behind him, a cluster of other interns watched with varying degrees of discomfort. "Excuse me," Jerome had said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "I'm just trying to do my job." "Oh, I'm not stopping you, man. Just making an observation. That's a pretty significant limp you've got there. Ever think about, I don't know, getting a job where you don't have to walk so much? Maybe something where you can sit down." Ethan had paused, his grin widening. "Oh wait, those jobs probably require skills you don't have. My bad." The other interns had shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, had touched Ethan's arm. "Come on, that's enough." But Ethan had been on a roll, his audience encouraging his cruelty through their silent witness. "I'm just saying, buddy, there's got to be something better out there for you than dragging yourself around this building all day. It's honestly kind of depressing to watch." Jerome had stood there, his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack, and said nothing. What could he say? This boy, because that's all he was, a boy playing at being a man, had never known what it was like to have doors slammed in your face because of something beyond your control. Had never spent hours filling out applications only to see the interviewer's expression change when you stood up from the chair. Had never had to choose between physical therapy and groceries. So Jerome had done what he always did. He'd swallowed his dignity, turned back to his mop, and continued working. The interns had eventually moved on, their laughter fading down the hallway like smoke. But that night, alone in his studio apartment in the Central District, Jerome had wept for the first time in years. Not because of the words, he'd heard worse, but because of how small those words had made him feel. How invisible. The next day, he'd requested a permanent transfer to the night shift. Better to be alone with the ghosts of other people's days than to risk that kind of humiliation again. Jerome blinked, pulling himself back to the present. His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of Ethan Crawford's desk. The past had a weight to it, a gravity that could pull you under if you weren't careful. He should leave. Finish his shift, go home, forget he'd ever seen that name or that face. What did it matter that the boy who'd mocked him had grown into a successful man? The world was full of people like Ethan Crawford, people who climbed over others on their way to the top and never looked back. But something kept Jerome rooted in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that small, wounded part of him that still burned with shame 15 years later. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a whisper in the back of his mind that this wasn't coincidence but something closer to fate. He forced himself to step back, to resume his cleaning. The office was immaculate as always. Ethan Crawford was clearly the type who valued appearances. Jerome dusted the shelves, emptied the trash, ran the vacuum over the expensive rug. All the while, he was acutely aware of that photograph, those eyes watching him from the desk. What would you say if you saw me now? Jerome thought, addressing the younger version of Ethan frozen in that frame. Would you even remember? Or was I just another nobody you crushed on your way up? The questions had no answers, and Jerome didn't really want them. He finished the office quickly, professionally, and moved on to the rest of his shift. But the discovery had unsettled something deep inside him, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward into the dark. Have you ever encountered someone from your past who hurt you, years after the fact? What would you do if you came face to face with them again? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. The following nights fell into an uncomfortable pattern. Jerome couldn't avoid Ethan's office. It was part of his assigned route, and skipping it would raise questions he didn't want to answer. So he cleaned it, just as he cleaned every other office, trying to maintain the professional distance that had served him well for 15 years. But he couldn't stop himself from looking. From piecing together the life of the man Ethan Crawford had become. The awards on the shelves told a story of rapid advancement. Top Performer 2018, Executive Circle 2020, Leadership Excellence 2022. There were photos from corporate retreats, charity galas, ribbon-cutting ceremonies. In every single one, Ethan wore the same expression, confidence bordering on arrogance, the smile of someone who knew he belonged in every room he entered. There were personal touches too. A Stanford pennant in a frame. A photo of Ethan with an older couple who had to be his parents, standing in front of what looked like a yacht. Another picture showed him with a beautiful blonde woman, both of them in hiking gear, mountains rising behind them. No wedding ring in the photo, Jerome noticed. No wedding ring on the desk either. The discovery shouldn't have mattered, but Jerome found himself constructing a narrative anyway. Ethan Crawford, successful, ambitious, probably single because he was married to his career. The kind of man who saw people as stepping stones or obstacles, never as equals. Did you ever think about me? The question haunted Jerome as he pushed his cart through the empty hallways. Did you ever wonder what happened to the janitor you humiliated? Or did I disappear from your memory the moment you turned away? A week passed. Then 2. Jerome fell back into his rhythm, though the discovery of Ethan's presence in the building had added a new weight to his nightly routine. He found himself timing his arrival at the executive suite for well after midnight, when there was no chance of an unexpected encounter. He wasn't afraid of Ethan Crawford. But he also wasn't interested in reopening old wounds. Some things were better left buried. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday night in late November when Jerome arrived for his shift. Seattle had been pounded by rain all week, the kind of relentless downpour that turned the streets into rivers and made the city feel like it was slowly dissolving into the sound. Jerome shook the water from his jacket as he clocked in, nodding to Gladys, the other night janitor, who was just finishing up the lobby. "Quiet night," she said, gathering her things. Most of the offices cleared out early because of the storm. Power flickered a few times around 9, but the backup generators kicked in. Jerome nodded, already mentally mapping his route. Fewer people meant faster work, and he could be home before the worst of the weather hit again. The building felt different that night, more hollow than usual, if that was possible. His cart wheels squeaked against the marble as he made his way to the elevators, the sound echoing in the cavernous lobby. The storm rattled the windows, wind howling like something alive and angry. He started on the 38th floor and worked his way up, moving through the offices with mechanical efficiency. By the time he reached the 42nd floor, it was nearly 2 in the morning. His leg ached more than usual. The damp weather always made it worse, the old injury throbbing in time with his heartbeat. The hallway was dark except for the emergency lighting, casting everything in a dim, greenish glow. Jerome flipped on the overhead lights, and they flickered once, twice, before settling into their usual fluorescent hum. He frowned. The power had been unstable all night, Gladys had said. He made a mental note to mention it to the building manager in the morning. He was halfway down the hall when he smelled it. Smoke. Not the usual smell of burnt coffee or someone's forgotten microwave popcorn. This was acrid, chemical, the kind of smoke that meant something was seriously wrong. Jerome's heart kicked into overdrive. He abandoned his cart and moved as quickly as his leg would allow, following the smell to its source. It was getting stronger, and underneath it, he could hear something, a low, crackling sound that made his stomach drop. The executive suite. Ethan Crawford's office. Smoke was seeping out from under the heavy wooden door, grey tendrils curling across the marble like grasping fingers. Jerome's hand hovered over the door handle, and he could feel the heat radiating through the wood. "Call 911. His rational mind screamed. "Get out of the building. This isn't your problem." But even as the thoughts formed, his hand was reaching for the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave without knowing if someone was inside. He grabbed the extinguisher and pushed the door open with his shoulder. The wall of heat hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The office was an inferno. Flames crawled up the curtains, consuming the expensive fabric in seconds. The desk was ablaze, papers curling and blackening. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking, and Jerome could barely see 3 feet in front of him. He raised his arm to shield his face, squinting through the smoke. The office appeared empty, thank God, but he needed to be sure. He took a step forward, his twisted leg nearly buckling beneath him as he navigated the unfamiliar terrain through the haze. That's when he heard it. A groan. Low, pained, coming from behind the desk. Jerome's blood turned to ice. Someone was in here. He dropped to his knees, easier to breathe closer to the floor, and crawled forward, the fire extinguisher forgotten. The smoke was so thick now he was navigating by sound alone, his eyes streaming, his lungs burning with each breath. Behind the desk, partially pinned beneath a fallen ceiling beam, was a man. Even through the smoke and shadows, even with the man's face contorted in pain and streaked with soot, Jerome recognized him instantly. Ethan Crawford. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. Jerome knelt there, frozen, while the fire raged around them and his mind waged a war with itself. This was the man who had humiliated him, who had mocked his disability in front of an audience and turned a moment of casual cruelty into a wound that Jerome had carried for 15 years. The man who had made him feel invisible, worthless, less than human. The beam had him pinned across the chest, and Ethan's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He was unconscious, maybe dying. And Jerome was the only one who knew he was here. You could leave, a dark voice whispered in Jerome's mind. Walk away. Call 911 from downstairs. Tell them you didn't know anyone was inside. By the time they get here, it'll be too late. The world won't miss another arrogant executive. And you'll finally have justice. The thought was seductive in its simplicity. Wasn't this what karma was supposed to look like? The scales finally balancing after 15 years. But even as Jerome considered it, he knew he couldn't do it. Because walking away would mean becoming the kind of person Ethan had always assumed he was. Someone whose worth was measured by their circumstances. Someone whose pain was less valid because they stood on a lower rung of society's ladder. Jerome had spent 15 years maintaining his dignity in a world that tried to strip it from him every day. He wasn't about to lose it now, even for revenge. God help me, Jerome muttered, and reached for the beam. It was heavier than it looked, and his first attempt to lift it failed completely. His hand slipped on the charred wood, and pain shot through his bad leg as he tried to brace himself. The smoke was so thick now he could barely breathe, and his vision was starting to tunnel. You can't do this, his body screamed. You're 53 years old with a disability. You're not strong enough. But Jerome had learned long ago that strength came in many forms. He positioned himself at a better angle, planted his good leg firmly, and used his back and shoulders to lift. The beam shifted, rose an inch, then two. Ethan groaned, his eyelids fluttering. Come on, Jerome gasped, tasting smoke and ash. Come on, you have to wake up. I can't carry you. The beam was moving now, and Jerome could feel something tearing in his shoulder, muscles protesting the impossible weight. But he kept lifting, inch by agonizing inch, until there was enough space to pull Ethan free. He grabbed Ethan under the arms and dragged him backward, away from the desk. Ethan was a dead weight, his expensive suit jacket torn, his face covered in soot and blood from a gash on his forehead. But he was breathing. Still alive. The fire had spread to the bookshelves now, and Jerome could hear glass shattering as the windows began to crack from the heat. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the whole office became a death trap. Jerome hooked his arms under Ethan's shoulders and began to drag him toward the door. Each step was agony. His twisted legs screamed in protest, threatening to give out entirely. His lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. The smoke was so thick he was navigating purely by memory and instinct. 5 feet from the door, Jerome's leg finally buckled. He went down hard, Ethan's weight pulling him backward. For a moment, he lay there on the burning carpet, his vision dimming, his body begging him to just close his eyes and rest. Get up, something inside him commanded. You didn't come this far to give up now. Jerome forced himself to his hands and knees. He grabbed Ethan's arms again and pulled, dragging them both toward the door with the last reserves of his strength. His hands found the door frame, and he used it to lever them both into the hallway. The difference in air quality was immediate and shocking. Jerome gasped, filling his tortured lungs with oxygen, coughing so hard he thought he might pass out. Ethan was still unconscious beside him, but his chest was rising and falling more steadily now. Jerome pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. Fire at Harrington Towers, 42nd floor, he managed between coughs. Executive suite. 1 person injured. We need ambulances and fire trucks. Now. He could hear sirens already. Someone else must have seen the smoke or flames from the street. But Jerome stayed on the line, giving the dispatcher details, even as his vision continued to swim and his body threatened to shut down. Behind them, something in the office exploded, probably the computer or the mini-fridge, and fresh flames billowed out into the hallway. Jerome used the last of his strength to drag Ethan further away, around the corner to the elevator bank where the air was clearer. Then, finally, he allowed himself to collapse against the wall, his twisted legs stretched out in front of him, his whole body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Ethan Crawford lay unconscious beside him, his chest rising and falling beneath his ruined suit. In the harsh glow of the emergency lights, he looked young, vulnerable, Nothing like the cocky intern who had haunted Jerome's memories for 15 years. Jerome's hand found its way to Ethan's wrist, checking for a pulse. Strong and steady. "You're going to be okay," Jerome whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Ethan or himself. "You're going to live." And then, because the irony was too much to bear in silence, he added, "You're welcome." The firefighters found them there 10 minutes later, Jerome barely conscious, Ethan still out cold, both of them covered in soot and ash. Jerome tried to explain what had happened, but his words came out in a jumbled rush, and then the paramedics were there, putting an oxygen mask over his face and loading him onto a stretcher. The hospital was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. They treated Jerome for smoke inhalation, gave him 4 fluids, cleaned and bandaged the burns on his hands that he hadn't even realized were there. A doctor with kind eyes told him he was lucky to be alive, that another minute in that smoke and his lungs might have given out entirely. Jerome didn't feel lucky. He felt empty, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that made him who he was. They kept him overnight for observation, and Jerome spent the long hours staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the fire over and over. The heat. The smoke. The impossible choice. Ethan's unconscious face in the firelight. "Why did you save him?" he asked himself. "After everything he did to you, why?" But he knew the answer. He'd known it even in the moment, even when that dark voice had whispered about revenge and justice. He'd saved Ethan because that's who Jerome Wallace was, not because Ethan deserved it, but because Jerome refused to let someone else's cruelty turn him into someone cruel. The next morning, a detective came to take his statement. Jerome told her everything, how he'd smelled the smoke, found Ethan unconscious, dragged him to safety. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, thanked him for his bravery. "The fire department says the blaze started from an electrical fault in the wall behind the desk," she told him. "With the storms we've been having, the building's wiring must have been compromised. If you hadn't been there." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Jerome was discharged that afternoon with prescriptions for pain medication and antibiotics, and instructions to follow up with his regular doctor. He took a cab back to his apartment, his entire body aching, his throat raw from the smoke. His phone had 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages. His supervisor, Gladys, even the building manager. Everyone wanted to know if he was okay, if he needed anything. The building was closed pending the fire investigation, and Jerome was on paid leave until the damage was assessed. He didn't return any of the calls. He took his medication, drew the curtains, and slept for 14 hours straight. When he woke, it was dark again, and for a disorienting moment, he thought he'd slept through an entire day. But his phone told him it was only 9 p.m. His body was stiff, every muscle protesting as he pulled himself out of bed. He was making coffee when his phone rang. Unknown number. Jerome almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Wallace." A woman's voice, professional and efficient. "This is Andrea Chen from Harrington Towers Management. I'm calling to check on your condition and to let you know that Mr. Crawford has been asking about you." Jerome's hand tightened on the phone. "He's awake." "Yes, he regained consciousness yesterday evening. The doctors say he's going to make a full recovery, thanks to you." There was warmth in her voice now, a genuine emotion breaking through the professional veneer. "Mr. Wallace, what you did was incredibly brave. The company would like to formally recognize your heroism. And Mr. Crawford, well, he's very insistent that he speak with you as soon as possible." Jerome's first instinct was to refuse. What did he and Ethan Crawford have to say to each other? The past was the past. He'd saved the man's life, and that was enough. They didn't need to have some awkward conversation about it. But even as he thought it, Jerome knew he was lying to himself. He did want to talk to Ethan. Needed to, maybe. Because there was a question burning in his chest, and it wouldn't be satisfied until he looked Ethan Crawford in the eye and asked it. "Do you remember me?" "Which hospital?" Jerome asked. Swedish Medical Center was a maze of white walls and antiseptic smells that made Jerome's stomach turn. He'd always hated hospitals. They reminded him of the weeks he'd spent here as a child after the accident that had twisted his leg, the sympathetic looks from nurses who knew his family couldn't afford the surgeries that might have fixed it properly. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt interminable. Jerome had changed into clean clothes, a simple button-down shirt and his good jeans, and he'd spent 20 minutes in front of the mirror that morning, trying to decide if he was making a mistake. His reflection had offered no answers, just stared back at him with tired eyes and graying hair. What are you hoping to find here? He'd asked himself. Closure? An apology? Recognition? He still didn't know. Room 412 was at the end of the corridor, and Jerome's twisted leg ached with each step, his limp more pronounced than usual. The nurse at the station smiled at him as he passed, a real smile, not the pitying kind he was used to, and he realized she probably knew who he was. The man who'd saved Ethan Crawford's life. Suddenly, he wasn't invisible anymore. The door was ajar. Jerome raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the gap, he could see a slice of the room, sterile white walls, medical equipment, the corner of a bed. He could still turn around. Walk away. Preserve the strange bubble of dignity he'd earned through his heroism without risking it on whatever waited inside that room. But he'd come this far. Jerome knocked softly and pushed the door open. Ethan Crawford sat propped up in bed, his chest wrapped in bandages, an oxygen cannula in his nose. His face was still bruised, a butterfly bandage over the cut on his forehead, but his blue eyes were alert. Sharp. When he saw Jerome, something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Mr. Wallace. Ethan's voice was hoarse, damaged by smoke. They told me you were coming. Please, come in. Jerome stepped into the room, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Ethan gestured to the chair beside the bed. Please, sit. You shouldn't be standing, not after what you went through. The casual concern in his voice made something twist in Jerome's chest. He moved to the chair and lowered himself slowly, his leg grateful for the reprieve. Up close, he could see the full extent of Ethan's injuries, the burns on his hands, the way his breathing was still labored despite the oxygen. How are you feeling? Jerome asked, because it seemed like the thing to say. Like I should be dead. Ethan's laugh was bitter, cut short by a cough. The doctors told me what happened. The beam, the smoke, how you dragged me out. They said another few minutes and... He didn't finish the sentence. You saved my life. Jerome nodded, unsure what to say. Why? The question came suddenly, sharp. Ethan was looking at him with an intensity that made Jerome want to look away. You didn't know me. You had no obligation to risk your life for mine. So why did you do it? Because I'm not the kind of man who lets people die, even when they deserve it. The thought flashed through Jerome's mind, but he couldn't say it out loud. Instead, he said simply, it was the right thing to do. The right thing. Ethan repeated the words slowly, as if testing them. Mr. Wallace, I've spent the last 2 days trying to figure out how to thank you. There aren't words big enough. You could have died in that fire. You could have called 911 and waited outside where it was safe. But you didn't. You came in after me. Jerome shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the praise. I was just doing my job. Your job is to clean offices, not to play hero in burning buildings. Ethan leaned forward, wincing at the movement. I want to do something for you. Compensation for your bravery. The company is already talking about a commendation, but I want to do more. Name it, anything, and it's yours. And there it was. The moment Jerome had been unconsciously waiting for since he'd gotten the call. The rich man's gratitude, packaged up in the language of debts and obligations. Ethan Crawford couldn't simply say thank you and leave it at that. He had to turn it into a transaction, something that could be quantified and settled. I don't want anything, Jerome said quietly. Ethan blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Mr. Wallace. Jerome. My name is Jerome. Jerome. Ethan adjusted himself in the bed, his brow furrowing. I don't think you understand. You saved my life. That deserves recognition. Reward. I have resources, connections. I can help you. Help me how? Jerome couldn't keep the edge out of his voice. Get me a better job? Pay for the surgeries I couldn't afford 30 years ago? Buy me a new apartment? He shook his head. I don't need your charity, Mr. Crawford. The temperature in the room had shifted, something cold settling between them. Ethan's expression hardened slightly, the vulnerability from moments before disappearing behind a more familiar mask of confidence. It's not charity. It's gratitude. It's the same thing when it comes from someone like you to someone like me. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Someone like me. Jerome met his eyes directly, and for the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to say what he'd been thinking all along. Someone who's never had to wonder where their next meal is coming from. Someone who's never been invisible because of the work they do or the way they walk. Someone who thinks every problem can be solved with money and connections. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan stared at him, his expression unreadable, and Jerome braced himself for anger, dismissal, the same casual cruelty he'd experienced 15 years ago. But instead, Ethan said softly, "You're right." Jerome hadn't expected that. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe offense, the wounded pride of a rich man being called out. But there was something else in Ethan's eyes now, something that looked almost like shame. "You're absolutely right," Ethan repeated. "I don't know what it's like to struggle. I grew up with every advantage, every door already open before I reached for the handle. And I've spent most of my life taking that for granted." He paused, his fingers plucking at the hospital blanket, and Jerome noticed for the first time that his hands were trembling slightly. "I've been lying here for 2 days, trying to piece together that night. I remember working late, remember the power flickering. I was on a call with Tokyo, and the lights went out completely for just a second. When they came back on, I smelled something burning, but I thought it was just the surge. By the time I realized the wall was on fire, it was too late to get out. The smoke was so thick, and then the ceiling came down." Ethan's voice faltered, and he took a shaky breath through the oxygen cannula. "I remember thinking I was going to die. That this was it, all my plans, all my ambitions, everything I'd worked for, and it was going to end in a burning office because I was too stubborn to leave when I first smelled smoke." He looked up at Jerome. "And then there were hands on me. Someone dragging me. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but someone was there, refusing to let me die." Jerome felt his throat tighten. He hadn't let himself think about those moments in detail, hadn't wanted to relive the fear and the pain and the impossible weight of Ethan's body as he dragged him to safety. "When they told me it was the night janitor who saved me, I tried to remember if I'd ever even seen you before. And I couldn't." Ethan's voice was thick with emotion now. "I worked in that building for 15 years, Jerome. 15 years, and I couldn't remember ever noticing the person who cleaned my office. The person who kept my space functional so I could do my job. That says something pretty damning about who I am, doesn't it?" "You're not alone in that," Jerome said quietly. "Most people don't notice the janitors. That's not an excuse. It's a choice." Ethan shifted in the bed, his expression intense. "I chose not to see you. Chose not to think about the people who made my success possible. And then you saved my life anyway." Jerome looked down at his hands, at the burns that were still healing, wrapped in clean white bandages. "I told you. It was the right thing to do." "But why?" Ethan pressed. "That's what I don't understand. You didn't owe me anything. In fact." He paused, and something changed in his expression. "Have we met before? Not just in passing in the building, but really met? There's something about you that feels familiar." Jerome's heart began to pound. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. He could lie, could say no and preserve the comfortable fiction that they were strangers. Or he could tell the truth and risk reopening wounds that had never properly healed. "Yes," he said finally. "We've met before." Ethan leaned forward, ignoring the pain the movement caused. "When?" 15 years ago. You were an intern, fresh out of Stanford. I was cleaning the hallway outside the conference rooms." Jerome kept his voice steady, factual, betraying none of the emotion churning beneath the surface. "You'd been at lunch with some other interns. You'd had some wine. And you decided to make some observations about my leg." He watched the color drain from Ethan's face, watched realization dawn like a slow, horrible sunrise. "Oh God," Ethan whispered. "Oh God, I remember." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan had gone completely still, his eyes wide with horror, and Jerome could practically see him reliving that day, seeing it now through the filter of time and, perhaps, maturity. "I was..." Ethan started, then stopped. Started again. "I was such an asshole." "Yes," Jerome agreed simply. "You were." "I don't remember everything I said, but I remember." Ethan closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were suspiciously bright. I remember laughing. I remember my friends laughing. And I remember you just standing there, taking it, because what else could you do? I transferred to the night shift the next day, Jerome said. Requested it specifically so I wouldn't have to risk running into people like you again. People like me. Ethan's voice was hollow. Jerome, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. What I did was cruel and thoughtless and inexcusable. And then, after all that, you still saved my life. Jerome had imagined this conversation countless times over the years, had rehearsed what he might say if he ever got the chance to confront Ethan Crawford with his past actions. But now that the moment was here, he found that most of his rage had burned away in that fire, leaving behind something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but perhaps understanding. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, Jerome said carefully. Not because you deserved it, and not because I'd forgotten what you did. I saved you because I refused to let the worst moments of my life define who I am. You made me feel small that day, invisible. But if I'd left you in that fire, I would have become the person you assumed I was, someone whose worth could be measured by their job title and their bank account and the way they walk. Ethan was crying now, tears running down his bruised face, and he made no attempt to hide them. I was 23 years old and full of myself, and I thought being clever and cruel made me powerful. But it just made me a bully. And you. His voice broke. You showed me what real strength looks like. What real character looks like. And I don't deserve it. I don't deserve your mercy. Maybe not, Jerome agreed. But I didn't do it for you. I did it for me. The words seemed to hit Ethan like a physical blow. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of them. I want to make this right, Ethan said after a long moment. I know I can't undo what I did 15 years ago. I can't take back those words or the pain they caused. But I can try to be better. To do better. If you'll let me. Jerome considered this. The old anger, the wound that had festered for so long, was still there. But it felt different now, less raw. Looking at Ethan Crawford, broken and vulnerable in a hospital bed, genuinely remorseful for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, Jerome couldn't quite hold on to the hate that had sustained him through so many lonely nights. I don't know what that looks like, Jerome admitted. I don't know if we can be anything. Friend seems like too much to ask. But maybe we don't have to be enemies. I'd like that, Ethan said quietly. And Jerome? Thank you. Not just for saving my life, but for giving me a chance to apologize. To look at who I was and try to become someone better. Jerome nodded. He stood slowly, his leg protesting the movement, and moved toward the door. But Ethan's voice stopped him. Wait. Jerome. Please. Just one more thing. Jerome turned back. Ethan was looking at him with an expression Jerome couldn't quite read, determination mixed with something that might have been hope. The company is going to want to do something public. A commendation, press coverage, probably a ceremony. And I know you said you don't want recognition, but... Ethan paused. Let them. Let people see what you did. Not for me, not for the company, but for every person out there who's ever been made to feel invisible. Let them see that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to. Jerome opened his mouth to refuse. He didn't want cameras or reporters or his face in the paper. But then he thought about all the people like him, the ones who cleaned offices and served food and fixed broken things, the ones who kept the world running while remaining unseen. Maybe it was time for them to be visible. Okay, he said quietly. I'll think about it. What would you have done in Jerome's position? Could you have forgiven someone who hurt you so deeply? Sometimes the hardest thing is showing mercy when we have every right to walk away. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to make a choice between revenge and compassion? The story broke 3 days later. Jerome had underestimated how much people loved a good redemption narrative, or maybe how hungry they were for stories of genuine heroism in a world that seemed increasingly cynical. The local news picked it up first, then the regional stations, and within 48 hours, CNN was running segments about the janitor who risked everything to save the executive who once mocked him. Jerome watched the coverage from his apartment with a mixture of discomfort and disbelief. They dug up his employment records, interviewed Gladys and other building staff, even tracked down some of the other interns who'd been there that day 15 years ago. One of them, the young woman with kind eyes who told Ethan to stop, gave a tearful interview about witnessing the incident and being too afraid to speak up more forcefully. "I've thought about that day so many times," she said on camera. "I've wondered what happened to that janitor, if he was okay. And now to learn that he's the one who saved Ethan's life. It's like the universe was trying to teach us all a lesson about dignity and character." The narrative had crystallized quickly. Jerome Wallace, the humble janitor with a disability, rising above his past mistreatment to save the life of the man who'd wronged him. It was simple, clean, the kind of story that felt good to tell. But Jerome knew the truth was more complicated. He hadn't saved Ethan to be noble or to prove a point. He'd done it because in that moment, faced with an impossible choice, he'd chosen to be the person his mother had raised him to be. The phone calls started almost immediately. Morning shows wanting interviews. Book agents seeing a bestseller. Speaking engagement requests from corporations wanting to lecture their employees about diversity and compassion. Jerome ignored most of them, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. But one call he did answer. "Mr. Wallace? This is Dr. Patricia Morrison from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling about your leg." Jerome's grip tightened on the phone. "My leg? I've been following your story, and I noticed in the coverage that you've had mobility issues since childhood from an improperly healed fracture. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and I specialize in corrective procedures for old injuries. I'd like to offer my services, pro bono, to see if we can improve your quality of life." Jerome sat down heavily on his couch. Why? "Because you deserve it. Because your story moved me. Because I have the skills to help and you shouldn't have to live in pain if there's something we can do about it." Her voice was warm, professional. No obligations, no strings. Just an evaluation to see what's possible. "Will you come in?" Jerome found himself saying yes. The evaluation was scheduled for the following week, but before that, there was the ceremony. The company had insisted, and Ethan had called personally to ask Jerome to attend. Not for publicity, he'd said, but because people needed to see them together, needed to witness what forgiveness and redemption could look like. So Jerome found himself in an uncomfortable suit, standing on a small stage in the Harrington Towers lobby while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Ethan stood beside him, still bearing the marks of the fire but dressed in an impeccable suit, his expression serious. The building manager gave a speech about heroism and company values. The fire marshal presented Jerome with a civilian Valor Commendation. And then it was Ethan's turn to speak. He stepped to the microphone, his hands gripping the podium, and the room fell silent. 15 years ago, I did something I'm deeply ashamed of," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I mocked this man for his disability. I made cruel jokes at his expense. I treated him as less than human because he cleaned floors while I sat in meetings. I did this because I was young and arrogant and I'd been taught that success meant looking down on people instead of lifting them up." You could have heard a pin drop. Jerome stood frozen, not expecting this level of public confession. 3 weeks ago, Jerome Wallace had every reason to leave me to die in that fire. Every reason to let karma settle the score. But he didn't. He risked his life to save mine, not because I deserved it, but because he's a better man than I was. Than I am. Ethan turned to look at Jerome directly. "You showed me what true character looks like. What real strength looks like. And you gave me a chance to become someone worth saving." Ethan's voice broke on the last words, and Jerome saw tears on his face. The room erupted in applause, but Jerome barely heard it. He was looking at Ethan Crawford, seeing not the arrogant intern or the successful executive, but a human being who'd been given a second chance and was determined not to waste it. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Ethan approached Jerome quietly. "Thank you for letting me say that," he said. "I needed people to know what I did. To understand that your heroism wasn't just physical." Jerome nodded. "What happens now?" "Now?" Ethan smiled, and it was different from the confident smirk Jerome remembered from 15 years ago. This smile was tentative, hopeful, genuine. "Now I try to earn the second chance you gave me. And I was hoping, maybe we could talk? Not as executive and janitor, but as two people trying to understand each other. Maybe over coffee sometime." Jerome thought about it. About all the anger he'd carried, and how much lighter he felt now that he'd let most of it go. About the strange, unexpected path that had led them both to this moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'd like that." 6 weeks after the fire, Jerome found himself in a hospital gown, lying on a pre-op bed while nurses bustled around him preparing for surgery. Dr. Morrison had been thorough in her evaluation, explaining that while they couldn't completely fix the damage from 30 years of improper healing, they could significantly improve his mobility and reduce his chronic pain. "It's not a miracle cure," she told him during their consultation. "You'll still have a limp, and there will be physical therapy, months of it. But you should be able to walk with less pain, maybe even without the constant ache you've been living with." Jerome had almost refused. He'd lived with his leg for 53 years. It was part of who he was. But then he'd thought about his mother, about how she'd cried when she couldn't afford the surgeries he'd needed as a child, about how she'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to give him a better life. She'd been gone 5 years now, but he could still hear her voice. "Baby, if someone offers you help and you need it, that ain't charity. That's grace." So here he was, about to let someone cut into his leg and try to undo decades of damage. "You have someone picking you up after recovery?" the nurse asked as she checked his fall. "Yes," Jerome said, and was surprised to realize it was true. Ethan had offered immediately when Jerome mentioned the surgery date. "I owe you my life," he'd said during one of their coffee meetings that had become surprisingly regular over the past month. "The least I can do is drive you home from the hospital." Their relationship had evolved into something Jerome couldn't quite define. Not quite friendship. There was still too much history, too much unresolved pain, but something more than acquaintances. They were two men learning to see each other as human beings rather than caricatures. Ethan was still privileged and sometimes thoughtlessly so, but he was also trying. Genuinely trying to understand the world from perspectives other than his own. "Mr. Wallace." Dr. Morrison appeared beside the bed, already in her surgical scrubs. "We're ready for you. Any questions before we get started?" Jerome shook his head. "Let's do this." As the anesthesiologist explained what would happen next, Jerome found his mind drifting back to that day 15 years ago. To the humiliation, the shame, the feeling of being invisible. He'd carried that moment with him for so long, had let it shape how he moved through the world. But maybe, he thought as the medication began to take effect and the world grew soft around the edges, maybe it was time to let it go. Not to forget, he would never forget, but to stop letting it define him. The last thing he remembered before the darkness took him was Dr. Morrison's steady voice. "You're going to be fine, Jerome. Better than fine." Jerome woke to the sound of quiet conversation and the antiseptic smell of recovery rooms. His leg was wrapped in fresh bandages, elevated on pillows, and there was a deep, bone-ache throb that the pain medication couldn't quite mask. But underneath the surgical pain, something was different. The old, familiar grinding sensation, the constant reminder of bones that had never quite healed right, was gone. His waking up. A nurse's voice, soft and professional. Jerome's eyes fluttered open. The recovery room was dim, curtains drawn around his bed. And sitting in the chair beside him, looking exhausted and worried, was Ethan Crawford. "Hey," Ethan said, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone took apart my leg and put it back together," Jerome managed, his voice rough. "That's basically what they did." Ethan smiled, but there was something tentative about it. Dr. Morrison said the surgery went well. Better than expected, actually. She said the bone had some healing capacity they weren't anticipating. Jerome nodded, still foggy from the anesthesia. "You've been here the whole time." "Yeah. I hope that's okay. I told them I was family." Ethan's expression turned sheepish. "I might have implied I was your nephew. They weren't going to let non-family wait, and I wanted to be here when you woke up." Something warm bloomed in Jerome's chest, unexpected and disarming. "Why?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Because 6 weeks ago, you saved my life. And not just physically, you saved me from becoming someone I would have hated. You gave me a chance to be better, to do better. And I know I can never repay that debt, but I can be here. I can show up. I can be the kind of person who doesn't just take from the world but gives back to it." He paused, meeting Jerome's eyes directly. "And because in the past 6 weeks, getting to know you, hearing your stories, understanding your perspective, it's changed me. You're not just the janitor who saved my life. You're a good man, Jerome. A man I'm proud to know. And I wanted to be here for you the way you were there for me." Jerome felt his throat tighten. He'd spent so much of his life being invisible, being overlooked, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Really seen. Not as a disability or a job title or a story to be told, but as a complete human being worthy of care and attention. Thank you, he said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence as the nurse came to check Jerome's vitals and adjust his pain medication. Dr. Morrison appeared shortly after, pleased with how he was responding to the surgery. You'll be here overnight for observation, then we'll get you set up with a physical therapist, she explained. The next few months will be challenging, but if you stick with the PT regimen, we should see significant improvement in your mobility. After she left, Ethan pulled out his phone. I took the liberty of researching physical therapists in your area. There's one who specializes in post-surgical orthopedic recovery, and she has excellent reviews. I already called to check her availability. Ethan, Jerome interrupted gently. Ethan stopped, looking uncertain. Too much? I'm being too much, aren't I? Gladys warned me you're independent and might not appreciate me trying to manage things, but I just wanted to help. It's fine, Jerome said, and realized he meant it. Thank you. For researching, for caring. Just, remember I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I need to be part of the decisions, not just of things done for me. Right. Yes. Absolutely. Ethan nodded vigorously. Partners in this, not me steamrolling over your autonomy. Got it. Jerome smiled despite the pain. You've been talking to Gladys a lot. She's become something of a consultant on how not to be an oblivious privileged guy, Ethan admitted. She's terrifying but very helpful. Did you know she has 4 kids and 7 grandchildren and has been working night shifts for 22 years to make ends meet? I never knew that. Never bothered to ask. And now I know everyone's name on the night cleaning crew. I know Miguel's daughter is applying to colleges and is worried about how to pay for it. I know Rose is taking online classes to get her nursing degree. I know Jimmy served 2 tours in Afghanistan and has PTSD that makes day shifts difficult. Ethan's expression was earnest, almost pleading. I know I can't fix everything, and I know knowing their stories doesn't erase years of being oblivious. But I'm trying, Jerome. I'm really trying. Jerome studied him. This man who had once been his tormentor and then became the person he saved and now was becoming something else entirely. Something like a friend. I can see that, Jerome said. And it matters. 3 days later, Jerome was home, navigating his apartment on crutches and trying not to feel frustrated by how difficult everything had become. The surgery had been successful, but recovery was its own kind of hell. Exercises that hurt, mobility restrictions that made him feel imprisoned, the constant need to ask for help with basic tasks. Ethan had been there every day, bringing groceries, helping with physical therapy exercises, generally making himself useful. It should have been suffocating, this constant presence of someone who'd once caused him so much pain. But instead, Jerome found himself looking forward to Ethan's visits, to their conversations that ranged from the philosophical to the mundane. It was during one of these visits, while Ethan was making dinner in Jerome's small kitchen, that everything finally crystallized. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Ethan said, stirring pasta sauce. About the company, about my career, about what actually matters. Jerome was seated at the small table, his leg elevated on a second chair. What brought this on? You, mostly. Ethan turned from the stove, his expression serious. Watching you rebuild your strength, seeing how you approach challenges, hearing your stories about your mother and how hard she worked to give you opportunities, it's made me realize I've been measuring success all wrong. He moved to the table, sitting down across from Jerome. I've spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder, thinking that was what mattered. More money, more power, more recognition. But what has it actually given me? A nice apartment I'm never in, a luxury car I barely drive, respect from people who don't really know me. Ethan shook his head. When I was trapped under that beam, thinking I was going to die, you know what I thought about? Not my achievements or my bank account. I thought about how empty my life was. How I'd spent so much time chasing success that I'd forgotten to build anything meaningful. So, what are you going to do? Jerome asked quietly. I'm stepping down as VP. Jerome's eyes widened. What? Not quitting entirely, Ethan clarified. But stepping back. I talked to the board about creating a new position, Director of Employee Relations and Workplace Culture. It would focus on things like fair wages, career development opportunities for support staff, making sure people at every level of the organization feel valued and seen. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with an enthusiasm Jerome had never seen before. I want to build programs that would have prevented someone like me from treating someone like you the way I did 15 years ago. Mentorship initiatives that pair executives with support staff. Education about unconscious bias and privilege. Creating pathways for people like Miguel's daughter to get company scholarships. Making Harrington Towers a place where everyone's dignity is respected, not just the people in corner offices. Jerome felt something shift in his chest, the last remnants of his anger finally dissolving. This wasn't performative guilt or temporary remorse. This was genuine transformation. That's ambitious, he said. It is. And I'm going to mess up a lot, probably say the wrong things and have to learn from my mistakes. But I want to try. I need to try. Ethan's voice grew quiet. You gave me my life back, Jerome. The least I can do is make sure it's a life worth having. It's not about paying me back, Jerome said firmly. This has to be about what you believe is right, not about settling a debt. It is. It's both. Ethan stood and went back to the stove, checking the pasta. I believe it's right because you showed me it was right. You showed me that dignity isn't something you earn through success, it's something every person deserves just by being human. And I can't unsee that now. I don't want to. They ate dinner together, talking about Ethan's plans, about Jerome's physical therapy progress, about the small moments that made up a life. And Jerome realized something that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks ago. He was happy. Not just content or resigned, but genuinely happy. The knock on the door came just as they were finishing their meal. Jerome frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Ethan stood to answer it, and Jerome heard a familiar voice in the hallway. Is Jerome Wallace here? I'm his physical therapist, Carla Johnson. We had a session scheduled. Oh, I'm so sorry, I think I have the wrong day. No, you're right on time, Ethan's voice came back. Come in, please. Ethan returned with a woman Jerome had never seen before, a black woman in her early 40s with warm eyes and a confident stride. She carried a professional bag and had the kind of presence that immediately put people at ease. Mr. Wallace? I'm Carla. Dr. Morrison's office scheduled me for your in-home PT sessions. She smiled. And I have to say, I've been following your story. It's an honor to work with you. As Carla set up her equipment and began explaining the treatment plan, Jerome caught Ethan watching from the kitchen with a small smile. This was the physical therapist he'd researched, the one he'd suggested. But he'd let Jerome make the final decision, had let Dr. Morrison's office handle the arrangements, had stepped back just enough to let Jerome maintain his autonomy while still ensuring he had the best care possible. His learning, Jerome thought. We both are. 4 months after the surgery, Jerome Wallace stood in front of Harrington Towers without crutches for the first time in what felt like forever. His leg still ached. Dr. Morrison had been right that it wasn't a miracle cure, but the constant grinding pain was gone. He could walk without dragging his foot, could stand for longer periods without his hip screaming in protest. The limp was still there, would always be there, but it was different now. Less pronounced. Less defining. He was scheduled to return to work tonight, his first shift since the fire. The building had been fully repaired, all new electrical wiring installed, state-of-the-art safety systems implemented. But Jerome wasn't sure he wanted to go back. Over the past 4 months, his life had changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The media attention had died down, but the impact remained. He'd been offered a position at the building management company, not janitor, but building services coordinator, with a significant pay increase and health benefits. He'd be supervising the cleaning crews, advocating for their needs, ensuring they had proper equipment and fair schedules. It was everything he'd never dared to dream of. Recognition. Respect. A chance to make things better for people like him. But accepting it meant giving up the simplicity of his old life. The quiet nights alone with his mop and his thoughts. The invisibility that, for all its pain, had also been a kind of protection. You're early. Jerome turned to find Ethan approaching, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. It was a Saturday, not a work day. Couldn't sleep, Jerome admitted. Kept thinking about going back in there. Nervous. More like, uncertain. About a lot of things. They stood side by side, looking up at the building that had been the site of so much pain and transformation for both of them. I talked to the board yesterday, Ethan said after a moment. They approved the new employee programs. Full funding, multi-year commitment. We start rolling them out next month. That's good. That's really good. There's something else. Ethan turned to face him. The board wants you to be part of it. Not just as building services coordinator, though that position is yours if you want it, but as a consultant. They want your perspective on how to make the company better for everyone, not just the people at the top. Jerome's breath caught. Ethan, I'm not. You're exactly the right person, Ethan interrupted. You've lived it. You know what it's like to be invisible, to be overlooked, to have your dignity questioned because of your job or your disability. That experience is valuable. Essential, actually, if we're going to do this right. I don't have a degree in business or HR or... You have something more important than that. You have integrity. You have perspective. You have the kind of moral clarity that I spent 15 years in business school never learning. Ethan's voice was passionate now. Jerome, you saved my life. Let me help you build the one you deserve. Not as charity, not as repayment, but as partners working towards something that matters. Jerome looked at him, this man who had started as his tormentor, become his victim, and was now offering him a future he'd never imagined possible. And he thought about his mother, about how she'd worked herself to exhaustion for opportunities that never quite materialized. About all the people like her, like him, who deserved better than invisibility. Okay, he said. Yes. I'll do it. Ethan's face broke into a genuine smile, and before Jerome knew what was happening, Ethan had pulled him into a hug. It was brief, awkward, but sincere. Thank you, Ethan said. For everything. For saving my life, for forgiving me a chance to be better. Thank you for becoming someone worth saving, Jerome replied. They stood there in the Seattle morning, two men who'd found redemption in the unlikeliest of places, ready to walk into the building together. Not as executive and janitor, not as victim and perpetrator, but as partners in building something better. 6 months later, Jerome sat in a conference room on the 42nd floor of Harrington Towers, the same floor where he'd once cleaned offices in the lonely hours after midnight. But now he sat at the table, not beneath it. His name was printed on the agenda, Jerome Wallace, Employee Advocacy Consultant and Building Services Coordinator. Around the table sat department heads, HR representatives, and Ethan, who'd fully transitioned into his new role as Director of Employee Relations and Workplace Culture. The position had taken a pay cut from his VP salary, but Ethan had told Jerome he'd never been happier. Next item on the agenda, said Patricia Chen, the Chief Operating Officer, is the Employee Scholarship Program proposal. Jerome, I believe you've been working on this with Ethan. Jerome cleared his throat, still not entirely comfortable speaking in rooms like this, but getting better with practice. Yes. We're proposing a scholarship fund specifically for children of Harrington Towers employees, maintenance, security, administrative staff, everyone. Not just for college, but also for trade schools, certificate programs, any education that leads to career advancement. He pulled up the presentation he and Ethan had spent weeks developing. Miguel Torres, one of our night janitors, has a daughter who's brilliant, straight A's, volunteering at a community center, dreams of becoming a civil engineer. But the family can't afford the application fees for most schools, let alone tuition. She's exactly the kind of student who should have every opportunity, but the system is stacked against her. Jerome clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about income inequality and educational access. There are dozens of Miguels working in this building. Hundreds across the company. And their kids deserve a chance. What's the proposed funding? Patricia asked, leaning forward with interest. Ethan spoke up. We're suggesting an initial endowment of $5 million, funded through a combination of corporate allocation and executive salary contribution, voluntary, but strongly encouraged. He paused. I've already pledged 10% of my salary for the next 5 years. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just about writing a corporate check, it was about personal investment. I'll match that, Patricia said suddenly. 10% for 5 years. Around the table, one by one, the other executives nodded their agreement. Jerome felt something swell in his chest. Hope, maybe, or vindication. Change was possible. Slow, difficult, but possible. There's one more thing, Jerome said, his voice stronger now. We want to name it the Dorothy Wallace Memorial Scholarship, after my mother. She worked as a housekeeper her whole life, never got to go to college herself, but she believed education could change lives. I think she'd be proud to have her name on something that gives other people's children the opportunities she couldn't give me." The room fell silent. Then Patricia smiled, and it was warm, genuine. "I think that's perfect. All in favor?" Every hand went up. The scholarship announcement made local news, but it was a different kind of coverage than before. Less about the dramatic rescue, more about systemic change. Jerome gave interviews alongside Ethan, and together they talked about dignity, respect, and the responsibility that came with privilege. But the real impact happened in the quiet moments. Like when Miguel found Jerome in the hallway one evening, tears streaming down his face, holding the acceptance letter his daughter had received from University of Washington, full ride, engineering program. The scholarship had covered her application fees, and the admissions office had taken notice. "I don't know how to thank you," Miguel said, his voice breaking. "My daughter, she's going to be an engineer." "An engineer, Jerome. She's going to build bridges." Or when Rose, the woman taking online nursing classes, was offered a full-time position in the company's new employee health services program, a job with benefits, regular hours, and tuition reimbursement to finish her degree. Or when Jimmy, the veteran with PTSD, broke down in Jerome's office one afternoon and admitted he'd been thinking about suicide before the new mental health benefits kicked in. The company now offered free counseling to all employees, no questions asked, no stigma attached. "You saved my life," Jimmy told him. "You and Mr. Crawford, you saved my life." These were the moments that mattered more than any ceremony or news coverage. These were the ripples spreading outward from that night in the fire, touching lives in ways Jerome was only beginning to understand. On a rainy Saturday morning, Seattle specialty, Jerome and Ethan sat in a small coffee shop in the Central District, their weekly ritual that had developed over the months. They'd moved past discussing work, past the careful navigation of their complicated history, into something that felt remarkably like genuine friendship. "I got a call from my father yesterday," Ethan said, stirring his coffee absently. "He wanted to know when I was going to stop playing social worker and get back to real business." Jerome winced. He'd heard about Ethan's father, old money, old attitudes, the kind of man who measured worth solely in dollars and market share. "What did you tell him?" "I told him this is real business. That building a company culture where people actually want to work, where they feel valued and respected, that's what leads to long-term success. Not quarterly earnings, not stock prices, but creating something sustainable and meaningful." Ethan smiled wryly. "He hung up on me." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. For the first time in my life, I'm disappointed in him instead of worried about him being disappointed in me. That feels like progress." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the rain streak down the windows. The coffee shop was busy with weekend crowds, families, couples, students with laptops. A whole cross-section of humanity, each person carrying their own stories, their own struggles. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said eventually. "Something I've been wondering about." "Sure." "Do you forgive me? Really forgive me, not just the polite version for the cameras?" Jerome considered the question carefully. It deserved honesty, not platitudes. "I'm not sure forgiveness works the way people think it does," he said slowly. "It's not a switch you flip where suddenly everything's okay and the past doesn't matter. What you did 15 years ago still hurt. I still remember it. There are still moments when I look at you and see that cocky in turn laughing at my leg." Ethan nodded, his expression pained but accepting. "But," Jerome continued, "I also see who you've become. I see the work you're doing, the lives you're changing. I see someone who looked at the worst version of himself and decided to be better. So maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting or even about making the pain go away. Maybe it's about choosing to move forward together instead of staying trapped in the past." "So, is that a yes or a no?" Ethan asked with a small smile. "It's a we're working on it," Jerome said. "And that's enough." Ethan raised his coffee cup. "To working on it." Jerome clinked his cup against Ethan's. "To working on it." 1 year after the fire, Harrington Towers held a celebration. Not for Jerome or Ethan specifically, but for everyone, a company-wide event recognizing the changes that had been implemented and the people who made the building run. The lobby had been transformed with tables of food, music playing, employees from every department mingling together. It was strange seeing the building like this, alive with laughter and conversation during hours Jerome had always known as quiet and empty. He stood near the windows, watching the sunset paint Elliott Bay in shades of gold and crimson, and felt a tap on his shoulder. Gladys stood there, dressed in her Sunday best, grinning from ear to ear. "Look at you, all fancy in your suit and tie. Who would have thought our quiet Jerome would end up here?" "I couldn't have done it without you," Jerome said honestly. "You kept me sane all those years on night shift. Reminded me I wasn't invisible." "Oh, baby, you were never invisible to me." She squeezed his hand. "And now the whole world can see what I always knew, that you're something special." Miguel approached with his daughter Sophia, who was tall and confident, wearing a UW engineering t-shirt with pride. "Mr. Wallace, I wanted Sophia to meet you properly. Tell him, Mija. I'm going to name my first bridge after you," Sophia said with the earnest certainty of 18. "The Jerome Wallace Bridge. Because you built a bridge for all of us, from where we were to where we could be." Jerome felt his eyes sting with tears. That's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me." The evening continued with speeches and toasts. Patricia Chen announced that the employee programs had exceeded all expectations, with measurable improvements in retention, satisfaction, and productivity. But more than that, she said, they'd created a culture where people felt like they mattered. When it was Jerome's turn to speak, he kept it brief. "A year ago, I was a night janitor with a limp and a lot of anger I didn't know what to do with. Then there was a fire, and I made a choice, not because I'm a hero, but because I'm a human being who believes other human beings deserve to be saved." He paused, looking around the room at all the faces watching him. "What I've learned since then is that we're all constantly making that choice. Every day, we choose whether to see each other's humanity or to look away, whether to lift each other up or to step over each other on our way to the top. And the beautiful thing is, every day we get to choose again." The applause was thunderous, but what Jerome remembered most was the look on Ethan's face, pride mixed with gratitude mixed with something that looked like peace. 2 years after the fire, Jerome Wallace stood in front of a full auditorium at Seattle Central College, giving a talk about dignity in the workplace. It was something he did regularly now, speaking engagements at companies, universities, community organizations. Telling his story not as a hero narrative but as a reminder that everyone's story mattered. In the front row sat Ethan Crawford, taking notes like a dedicated student. They'd come a long way from that hospital room where the past had finally been acknowledged. Ethan had become more than just someone Jerome had saved. He'd become a genuine friend, a partner in creating change, someone Jerome trusted. After the talk, a young man approached, maybe 22 or 23, nervous energy radiating off him. "Mr. Wallace? I just wanted to say, I'm an intern at a tech company downtown, and last week I saw one of the janitors struggling with a heavy trash bag. And I almost walked past because I was late for a meeting. But then I remembered your story, and I stopped and helped her. And we talked, and I learned she's putting herself through nursing school and she's brilliant and she should have opportunities to use that brilliance." He paused, his eyes bright with conviction. "So I talked to my manager, and we're creating an internship program for support staff who want to transition into tech roles. Because of you. Because you showed us that everyone deserves to be seen." Jerome felt his throat tighten. This was it, the real legacy of that night in the fire. Not the rescue itself, but the ripple spreading outward, changing how people saw each other, creating opportunities where none had existed before. "That's wonderful," Jerome managed. "Thank you for sharing that with me." After the young man left, Ethan joined Jerome near the auditorium exit. "You know what's amazing?" Ethan said. 2 years ago, I would have been that kid walking past the janitor. Hell, 2 years ago I was worse than that kid. And now here we are, creating programs and policies and cultural shifts that would have seemed impossible back then." "People can change," Jerome said simply, "because other people give them the chance to." Ethan looked at him seriously. "Jerome, I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you. Not just for saving my life, but for saving me from the person I was becoming. You gave me something more valuable than a second chance. You gave me a mirror to see who I really was, and then you gave me the grace to become someone better." Jerome smiled. "You did the work, Ethan. I just opened the door. We make a good team." "Yeah," Jerome agreed. "We do." They walked out of the auditorium together, into the crisp Seattle evening, past the campus where students hurried to classes and dreamed about their futures. Jerome's leg still ached sometimes, especially when it rained, but it was a manageable ache now. A reminder of where he'd been, not a prison keeping him from where he was going. His phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Sophia just got an internship at a civil engineering firm. They said the Dorothy Waller scholarship on her resume caught their attention. Thank you, hermano. Thank you for everything. Jerome showed the text to Ethan, who grinned broadly. Your mom would be proud, Ethan said softly. Yeah, Jerome said, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest like warmth. She would be. Jerome's story reminds us that our actions echo far beyond the moment we make them. The choice to show mercy, to extend grace, to see the humanity in others, these choices create ripples that can change lives in ways we might never fully understand. What choice will you make today? Who will you choose to see? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The Dorothy Wallace Community Center opened on a sunny Saturday in May, 5 years after the fire that had changed everything. It was housed in a renovated building in the Central District, funded by a combination of corporate donations, grants, and individual contributions. The center offered job training, GED programs, childcare services, and a scholarship resource center, everything Jerome's mother had wished existed when she was struggling to give her son a better life. Jerome stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, his leg only slightly bothering him these days, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the ripples of that one choice in a burning building. Miguel and Sophia were there. She was graduating from UW in 2 weeks with a degree in civil engineering and multiple job offers. Rose had completed her nursing degree and was working at the center's health clinic. Jimmy had found peace through therapy and now ran the center's veteran support program. And Ethan was there, of course, no longer the cocky intern or even the guilty executive, but simply a man who'd learned that true success was measured not in profit margins but in lives changed and dignity restored. I can't believe we did this, Ethan said quietly as they watched the community gather for the celebration. We didn't do it alone, Jerome replied, gesturing to everyone assembled. This is what happens when people choose to see each other, to help each other, to believe that everyone deserves dignity and opportunity. The mayor finished her speech, and Jerome was called to the podium to cut the ribbon. As he stood there, scissors in hand, he thought about the journey that had led him to this moment. The pain, the humiliation, the anger, the fire, the choice, the unexpected friendship that had grown from ashes. But mostly he thought about his mother, Dorothy Wallace, housekeeper, dreamer, believer in the possibility of better tomorrows. Mama, he whispered as he raised the scissors, this is for you. For everyone like you. For everyone who was told they were invisible but refused to believe it. He cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted in applause. The Dorothy Wallace Community Center was officially open, a testament to what could happen when people chose compassion over cruelty, grace over grievance, possibility over prejudice. That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the center had closed for the day, Jerome and Ethan sat on the front steps, watching the sun set over the Seattle skyline. Do you ever think about that night? Ethan asked. About what would have happened if you'd made a different choice? Sometimes, Jerome admitted. But I try not to. Because dwelling on the what ifs means missing the what is. And what is, it's pretty damn good. Ethan laughed. Yeah, it really is. They sat in comfortable silence, two men who had started as enemies, become survivor and savior, and ended up as brothers in all the ways that mattered. The city lights began to flicker on, and somewhere in the distance, Jerome could hear music playing. Someone's radio, maybe, or a street performer. You know what the best part is? Jerome said eventually. It's not this center, as wonderful as it is. It's not the programs or the scholarships or any of the tangible things we've built. What is it? It's knowing that somewhere out there, there's a young executive who stopped to help a janitor carry something heavy. There's a kid who stood up to a bully instead of laughing along. There's a person who chose to see someone else's humanity instead of looking away. That's the real legacy, not buildings or programs, but choices. Every single day, people are choosing to be better because they heard this story. That's what matters. Ethan nodded slowly. You're right. You're absolutely right. Of course I am, Jerome said with a grin. I'm a hero, remember? We're always right. Oh, is that how it works? That's exactly how it works. They laughed together as the stars began to appear overhead, and Jerome felt something he hadn't felt in the first 53 years of his life: complete. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, and never would be, but because he'd learned that wholeness didn't come from circumstances or recognition or even justice. It came from making choices aligned with who you wanted to be, and then living with those choices every single day. He'd chosen to save a life that night in the fire. And in doing so, he'd somehow saved his own. The janitor who'd been mocked for his limp had become a bridge builder, a changemaker, a man whose name would be remembered long after the fire was forgotten. Not because of what had been done to him, but because of what he had chosen to do despite it. And that, Jerome thought as he watched the city lights twinkle like earthbound stars, that was victory. That was redemption. That was the truest kind of justice, not revenge, but transformation. That was grace. Jerome Wallace's story reminds us that heroism isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about the quiet choice to extend mercy when we have every right to withhold it. It's about seeing the humanity in others even when they've failed to see ours. And it's about believing that people can change, that redemption is possible, and that our choices today create the world of tomorrow. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Every interaction is an opportunity to choose kindness over cruelty, dignity over dismissal, grace over grudges. What will you choose? Thank you for experiencing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, you have the power to be someone else's hero, simply by choosing to see them.